Martha Coleman was 71 years old, and the only thing she owned was a house that was falling apart. She stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring at the structure in front of her, a sagging roof, windows boarded up or shattered, weeds so tall they'd swallowed the front porch. The deed in her hand felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of something more than paper. This wasn't a gift. It was a burden no one else wanted, and somehow, it had landed in her lap. Her nephew had driven her here that morning. He'd barely looked at her when he handed over the keys, muttering something about how the will said it was technically hers, how his mom, Martha's sister Eleanor, had left it to her. He didn't stay long. Just dropped her off with a single suitcase and drove away before she could ask any questions. Martha watched his taillights disappear down the street, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely alone. The house looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips. The front steps tilted at an angle that didn't seem safe. A rusted mailbox hung by a single nail, swaying slightly in the breeze. This was supposed to be her inheritance. This rotting shell on the edge of town, where the streetlights didn't quite reach and the neighbors kept their distance. She had $200 in her wallet. That was it. Everything else, gone. The apartment she'd been renting had raised the rent again, and this time, she couldn't make it work. The eviction notice had come 3 weeks ago. She'd spent those weeks calling everyone she could think of, looking for somewhere to go, somewhere affordable, somewhere that didn't require a deposit she couldn't afford. No one had answers. And then her nephew showed up with the deed and a half-hearted apology. Martha took a slow breath and looked up at the house again. The roof sagged in the middle like a spine that had given up. Several shingles were missing entirely. She could see daylight through gaps in the walls. A gutter hung loose, swinging gently in the wind, scraping against the siding with a sound that set her teeth on edge. A woman across the street was watching from her porch. Martha caught her eye for a moment, but the woman looked away quickly, disappearing back inside her house. It wasn't the first time. She'd noticed it when she arrived, curtains twitching, faces in windows, people who saw her standing here and decided not to say hello. There was something about this place that made people uneasy. She could feel it too, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. She picked up her suitcase and started toward the house. The walkway was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through every gap. The porch groaned under her weight, the wood soft in places, spongy with rot. She tested each step carefully, half expecting the boards to give way. The front door was swollen in its frame, paint flaking off in chunks. It took 3 hard shoves before it scraped open, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled like mold and something older, something she couldn't quite name. The inside was worse than the outside. Wallpaper hung in strips from the walls. The ceiling was stained with water damage, brown blooms spreading across the plaster like bruises. Dust coated everything, thick and undisturbed. Broken furniture sat where it had been left, a couch with the stuffing coming out, a table missing 2 legs, a lamp lying sideways on the floor. It looked like someone had walked out one day and never come back. Martha set her suitcase down and stood in the doorway, trying to process what she was looking at. This was her home now. This wreckage. This place that everyone else had refused. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did neither. She just stood there, feeling the weight of 71 years pressing down on her shoulders, wondering how her life had come to this. The light was fading outside. She'd need to figure out where to sleep, if there was even a room safe enough to stay in. She took a step forward, and the floorboard beneath her foot let out a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house. She froze, her heart jumping in her chest. For a moment, she thought the floor might collapse entirely. But it held. She looked down. The board had split down the middle, the wood darker underneath, like it had been damp for years. And there, in the gap, she saw something. Not just floor joists and insulation. Something else. Something that didn't belong. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. I need to know you're with me on this journey. And comment below with your country so I can see where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to see what happens next. Martha knelt down slowly, her knees protesting, and leaned closer to the broken board. She couldn't quite see what it was. But she knew, somehow, that whatever lay beneath this house was the reason no one else had wanted it. Martha hadn't always been the woman standing in a ruined house with $200 to her name. There was a time when her life had felt full. When she'd wake up at 6 every morning, make coffee in the kitchen she shared with Thomas, and head to Franklin Elementary where she'd taught 3rd grade for 40 years. The kids called her Mrs. Coleman, and they loved her in that fierce, uncomplicated way children do. She kept every card they ever gave her, every crayon drawing, every note that said, "You're the best teacher ever," in wobbly handwriting. Those boxes were in storage now. She couldn't afford to keep paying for the unit, so they'd be auctioned off soon. Another piece of her life, gone. Thomas had been gone for 8 years. Heart attack. Sudden. One morning he was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, complaining about the crossword puzzle, and by that afternoon he was gone. The funeral costs came first, then the hospital bills they said were her responsibility even though he'd died before he got there. Then the mortgage on the house they'd spent 30 years paying off. She thought she'd be okay. She had savings. She had the pension. But the bills kept coming, each one bigger than the last, and suddenly lawyers were involved, collection agencies were calling, and she was signing papers she didn't fully understand just to make it stop. A man in a suit had convinced her to take out a loan. Predatory, they called it later, but by then it was too late. The interest rates were criminal, designed to trap people exactly like her, people who were desperate and didn't know where else to turn. She lost the house 18 months after Thomas died. Everything she and Thomas had built, gone in a single afternoon when the bank came to change the locks. She'd moved into a cramped studio apartment across town. One room with a kitchenette and a bathroom so small she could barely turn around. She told herself it was temporary. She'd get back on her feet. She'd figure it out. But rent kept going up, and her pension barely covered groceries. She started skipping meals. Started choosing between medication and electricity. Started realizing that there was no safety net, no one coming to help, no happy ending waiting around the corner. Eleanor had been her only family. Her younger sister by 3 years. They'd been close once, back when they were girls sharing a bedroom and secrets. But somewhere along the way, they'd drifted apart. Martha couldn't even remember what they'd fought about anymore. Something stupid, probably. Something that felt important at the time but meant nothing in hindsight. They'd stopped calling. Stopped visiting. Years turned into silence, and before Martha knew it, they were strangers who happened to share blood. She'd found out about Eleanor's death from the nephew. A phone call, brief and awkward. The funeral had already happened. Martha hadn't been invited. Or maybe she had been, and the invitation had gotten lost somewhere in the chaos of her life. Either way, she'd missed it. She'd cried alone in her studio apartment, mourning not just her sister but the relationship they'd never repaired, the conversations they'd never have, the apology she'd never get to make. And then the nephew showed up with the deed. He'd looked uncomfortable, standing in her doorway with his hands in his pockets. Said his mom had left Martha a house in the will. Said it wasn't much, but it was hers if she wanted it. Martha had felt a flicker of something then, hope, maybe, or just relief that she wouldn't be homeless. She'd asked questions. Where was it? What condition was it in? Could she sell it? He'd been vague, evasive. Said she should just go see it herself. She should have known then that something was wrong. The eviction notice came 2 days later. She had 3 weeks to vacate. 3 weeks to figure out where a 71-year-old woman with no money and no family goes when the world decides it's done with her. So here she was. standing in a house that looked like it had been waiting to collapse for decades. The nephew had dumped this place on her because it was worthless to him, a rotting liability he didn't want to deal with. He'd probably hoped she'd refuse it, let it go back to the county, make it someone else's problem. But Martha didn't have the luxury of refusal. This wreck, this tomb, this structure held together by stubbornness and dry rot, it was the only thing standing between her and the street. She walked through the rooms slowly, taking inventory. Every floor creaked. Every wall bore the stains of years of neglect. The bathroom had no running water. The kitchen cabinets hung at odd angles, doors missing or hanging by a single hinge. Upstairs, if she dared to go up there, the ceiling had caved in completely in 2 of the rooms. This wasn't a home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was hers. The only thing she had left in the world that belonged to her. Martha stood in the center of what used to be a living room and felt the full weight of her situation settle over her like a heavy blanket. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd had, about how far she'd fallen from that. She thought about Eleanor, about all the years they'd wasted being angry over something neither of them could remember. She thought about the students who used to hug her in the hallways, who probably didn't think about her anymore, who'd moved on with their lives while hers had quietly fallen apart. She was 71 years old, and she was standing in the ruins of someone else's abandoned life, trying to figure out if there was anything worth salvaging in her own. The broken floorboard caught her eye again. The crack she'd made when she first walked in. The darkness underneath. She'd been too tired to investigate it last night, too overwhelmed. But now, in the dim morning light filtering through the broken windows, she found herself staring at it again. Something was down there. She was sure of it now. And maybe, just maybe, understanding what had happened in this house would help her understand what happened to Eleanor. Why her sister had kept this place secret for so many years. Why she'd left it to Martha instead of her own son. Martha knelt down beside the broken board, her knees aching in protest, and reached for the splintered wood. If this house was going to be her tomb, she might as well know what she was being buried with. Martha made the decision that night. She would stay. There was nowhere else to go, no one to call, no backup plan waiting in the wings. This house, broken as it was, represented something she hadn't had in a long time, a choice. Not a good choice, maybe not even a safe one, but it was hers to make. So she cleared a corner of the living room, pushing aside debris and sweeping away the worst of the dust with her hands. She unfolded the camping cot she'd bought years ago for a trip she and Thomas never took, spread out the thin blanket from her suitcase, and tried to convince herself this was temporary. The electricity had been shut off decades ago. She used her phone as a flashlight, the battery already down to 60%. She'd have to find somewhere to charge it tomorrow. A library, maybe, or a coffee shop if she could afford a cup. For now, the pale glow was all she had, casting long shadows across the walls that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The house made sounds. Not the sounds of something living, but the sounds of something dying slowly. Wood groaned under its own weight. Somewhere above her, something shifted, sending a small rain of plaster dust down through the ceiling. The wind outside found every crack and gap, whistling through the broken windows with a low, mournful sound that made her pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She lay on the cot, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, and tried not to think about how far she'd fallen. A year ago, she'd had an apartment. Not much, but it was warm and the roof didn't leak and she didn't have to wonder if the floor would hold her weight. Now she was camping in a condemned house with $200 and a phone that would die by morning. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound made her tense. A sharp crack from somewhere in the back of the house. A long, low creak that seemed to travel through the walls. The scratch of tree branches against broken windows. She told herself it was just the house settling, just old wood and shifting foundations, nothing to be afraid of. But there was something about this place that felt wrong. Not haunted, she didn't believe in that, but wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. Like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Around 3 in the morning, she heard footsteps. No, not footsteps. Just the floorboards adjusting to temperature changes, expanding and contracting in the cold. That's what she told herself. But it sounded exactly like someone walking slowly through the rooms upstairs, careful and deliberate. She listened, frozen under her blanket, until the sound stopped. Then silence. Deep and absolute. She didn't sleep after that. When the first gray light of dawn finally crept through the windows, Martha gave up on rest. Her back ached from the cot, her neck was stiff, and her eyes felt gritty with exhaustion. But she was alive, and the house hadn't collapsed on her in the night, so she counted that as a win. She needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed to know if this place could be salvaged or if she was camping in a death trap. She started with the kitchen. The floor there worried her immediately. It sagged in the center, the boards bowing downward like something had rotted away underneath. She tested it carefully, staying near the walls where the support seemed stronger. The cabinets were empty except for mouse droppings and the desiccated corpse of something that might have been a rat. The sink was dry, the pipes probably broken or disconnected. She turned the faucet anyway, out of habit, and nothing happened. No water. No surprise. The bathroom was worse. The toilet had cracked straight down the middle. The tub was filled with leaves and debris that had blown in through a broken window. Black mold climbed the walls in organic patterns that looked almost intentional. She backed out of there quickly, pulling the door shut. That room was a lost cause. She moved through the rest of the first floor methodically. A dining room with a collapsed chandelier on the floor. A hallway where the wallpaper had peeled away to reveal older wallpaper underneath, layers of it, decades of attempts to make this place feel like home. And then, at the back of the house, a small room that must have been a study. This room felt different. The walls were lined with empty bookshelves, the wood still solid despite the years. A desk sat against one wall, drawers hanging open and empty. But it was the floor that caught her attention. Most of the house had the same worn, darkened floorboards throughout, wood that had aged to a deep brown over decades. But in this room, in one section near the window, the boards looked lighter. Newer. Like someone had replaced them long after the house was built. Martha knelt down and ran her hand across the seam where the old boards met the new ones. The transition was obvious once you were looking for it. Someone had pulled up the original floor in this spot and put down fresh boards. Not recently, the wood still looked like it was 30 or 40 years old, but definitely newer than the rest. She pressed down on the boards, testing them. They were solid. Well installed. Whoever had done this work knew what they were doing. But why? Why replace just this section? Why not the whole floor? She looked around the room again, trying to see it through different eyes. Had something spilled here? Had the original boards rotted through? Or had someone needed to get underneath for some reason, and then covered their work back up? The broken board in the living room flashed through her mind. The crack she'd made yesterday, the darkness she'd glimpsed underneath. She hadn't investigated it yet, hadn't worked up the courage or the energy. But now, looking at these deliberately replaced floorboards, she felt curiosity pulling at her like a tide. This house had secrets. She'd known that the moment she saw it, the moment she felt how the neighbors avoided looking at it. But now she was starting to understand that the secrets went deeper than abandonment, deeper than decay. Someone had lived here once. Her sister, she knew that much from the nephew. But Eleanor had left, had walked away from this place and never spoken of it again. And before she left, she'd done something to this floor. Hidden something, maybe, or buried something, or tried to erase evidence of something that had happened here. Martha sat back on her heels, her heart beating faster than it should. She was 71 years old, exhausted, running on no sleep and no breakfast. She should be figuring out how to get water running, how to make this place livable, how to survive. But all she could think about was what lay beneath these floors. What had Eleanor been hiding? And why had she left it here, sealed away in a house she'd abandoned, a house she'd eventually given to Martha like some kind of inheritance or curse or apology? Martha stood up slowly, her knees protesting. She looked down at the newer floorboards one more time, then back toward the living room where the broken board waited. She was going to find out. Whatever it took, whatever she had to tear apart in this crumbling house, she was going to find out what her sister had left behind. Martha found the door by accident. She'd been examining the hallway, trying to map out which parts of the house were safe to walk through, when she noticed something odd about the wall. A seam, barely visible under layers of peeling wallpaper. She pulled at the paper, and it came away in long strips, revealing a door frame underneath. The door itself was so warped and swollen it sat flush with the wall, painted over multiple times until it almost disappeared. This wasn't a closet. The frame was too wide, the placement too deliberate. This was a room someone had tried very hard to hide. She pressed her shoulder against the door and pushed. Nothing. The wood had swollen with decades of moisture, jamming it tight in the frame. She tried again, harder this time, throwing her full weight against it. Something cracked, and the door shifted slightly. One more push, and it scraped open with a sound like a scream, releasing a rush of air that smelled like dust and time and secrets kept too long. Martha stepped inside and stopped breathing. The room was small and windowless. Completely dark except for the light spilling in from the hallway behind her. She used her phone flashlight, sweeping it across the space. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts against the walls. Boxes were stacked in careful towers, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. And there, in the corner, chained to a support beam with a heavy metal chain, was a lockbox. The air in here was different. Stale, untouched, preserved like something in a tomb. No one had been in this room for decades. She was certain of that. The dust on every surface was thick and uniform, undisturbed. Even the cobwebs in the corners looked ancient, their architects long dead. Her hands trembled as she walked toward the lockbox. It was old military-style metal, dark green and rusted at the corners, but still intact. The chain wrapped around it multiple times, secured to the beam with a padlock that had fused with corrosion. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure this stayed exactly where it was. Martha knelt beside it, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried the lock, knowing it wouldn't open. It didn't. She pulled at the chain, but it held firm. Whatever was inside this box, someone had wanted it locked away. Not just hidden, secured. Chained down like something that might escape if given the chance. She sat back on her heels, her mind racing. This room had been sealed deliberately. Not abandoned, sealed. The door painted over, hidden behind wallpaper, swollen shut with moisture that suggested it hadn't been opened in 30 or 40 years. And inside, this lockbox, chained and locked, containing something someone thought was worth protecting even as they let the rest of the house fall apart around it. Eleanor. This had to be Eleanor's work. Her sister had lived here, had sealed this room, had walked away and never come back. But she'd left this behind. Why? What could possibly be in that box that was worth all this? Martha thought about the replaced floorboards in the study. The careful repair work someone had done decades ago. The way the nephew had been so eager to hand off this property, like he couldn't get rid of it fast enough. The way the neighbors wouldn't meet her eyes. This house wasn't just abandoned. It was hiding something. Before you go any further, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a like if you're hooked on this story. And comment your country below so I can see where everyone's watching from. Because what happens next, you're not going to believe. Martha stood up, her decision made. She didn't have a key. She didn't have bolt cutters or any way to break a rusted lock that had been sitting here since before she retired from teaching. But she was going to open that box. She was going to find out what Eleanor had locked away in this room, what secret was so important it had to be chained down and sealed behind a hidden door. She had nothing left to lose. And maybe, just maybe, this box held the answer to why her sister had given her this broken house instead of throwing it away like everyone else wanted to. Martha walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind her, and went to find something strong enough to break a lock that had been waiting 40 years to be opened. The neighbor didn't want to help. Martha had knocked on 3 doors before anyone answered. The woman who finally opened up looked at her with barely concealed suspicion, eyes flicking past Martha to the ruined house across the street like she was checking to make sure it was still there. Martha explained what she needed: bolt cutters, a crowbar, anything strong enough to break through an old lock. The woman hesitated, clearly torn between neighborly obligation and whatever instinct told her to stay away from that house and anyone connected to it. In the end, she disappeared into her garage and came back with a rusty pair of bolt cutters and a warning. "Don't know what you're looking for in that place," she said, "but my advice? Leave it alone." Martha thanked her and promised to return the tools by evening. Back in the sealed room, she positioned the bolt cutters around the chain. Her hands shook with a combination of exhaustion and adrenaline. The metal was old and corroded, and it took 3 attempts before the chain finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house. The lockbox sat free now, no longer tethered to the beam. She tried the lock itself next. It took longer, her arms burning with effort, but eventually the rusted padlock snapped and fell to the floor. Martha set the bolt cutters aside and placed her hands on the lid of the box. For a moment, she just sat there, breathing hard, aware that once she opened this, there was no going back. Whatever Eleanor had locked away 40 years ago was about to become her burden too. She lifted the lid. The hinges screamed in protest, and then it was open. Inside, carefully arranged like artifacts in a museum, were the pieces of a life Martha had never known existed. Bundles of letters tied with string, the paper yellowed and brittle. Photographs, dozens of them, showing people she didn't recognize: a younger Eleanor, smiling in some, her face tight with something that might have been fear in others. A man appeared in several photos, dark-haired and handsome in that studied way some men are, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. And beneath the letters and photographs, wrapped carefully in a faded cloth, were stacks of cash. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She pulled the cloth aside with trembling fingers. $20 bills, 50s, 100s, all bound in neat bundles with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity. The bills were old, she could tell from the design, from the way they felt under her fingers. Money from the 70s and 80s, hidden away and forgotten. She counted quickly, her hands shaking harder with each stack. $43,000. Maybe more. She lost count and had to start over twice. $43,000, sitting in a locked box in a sealed room in a house everyone thought was worthless. Her mind reeled. This was enough to fix the house. Enough to make it livable. Enough to survive on for years if she was careful. Eleanor had left her more than a broken structure, she'd left her a lifeline. But why? Why hide it? Why lock it away and never come back for it? She reached back into the box, her fingers finding one more item beneath the cash. A journal, leather-bound and worn, the pages yellowed with age. She lifted it out carefully, afraid it might disintegrate in her hands. The cover was unmarked, but when she opened it to the first page, she recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor's handwriting. Neat and careful, the way she'd always written, even as a girl. The first entry was dated June 1978. Nearly 50 years ago. And it was signed at the bottom, E.M. Eleanor Morrison. Her married name from her first marriage, the one Martha had never heard about, the husband who'd never been mentioned. Martha's eyes moved to the first line, and her blood went cold. If you're reading this, it means I failed. And I'm so sorry. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each one heavy with implications Martha wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Failed at what? Sorry for what? She turned the page, her hands shaking so badly now that the paper rattled. The next entry began simply, almost casually, as if Eleanor were writing to a friend. His name is Vincent, and I thought I loved him when we got married. I was 23 and stupid and I didn't see the warning signs until it was too late. By the time I understood what kind of man he really was, I was already trapped. Martha's throat tightened. She kept reading. He controls everything. The money, the car keys, even the phone. He checks the mileage when he gets home from work. He counts the eggs in the refrigerator. Last week I tried to visit you, Martha, but he found out somehow. Anne. The entry ended there, the rest of the page blank, like Eleanor had been interrupted or couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Martha flipped through more pages, her eyes catching fragments of her sister's life. Entries about hiding money, a few dollars at a time, skimmed from grocery money or found in coat pockets. Notes about planning an escape. Descriptions of violence that made Martha's stomach turn. And throughout it all, Eleanor's voice, scared, desperate, but determined. This house had been her prison. And this box, this hidden room, had been her escape plan. Martha sat on the dusty floor, surrounded by cash and letters and photographs of a sister she'd never really known, and felt tears sliding down her face. All those years they hadn't spoken. All those years she'd been angry over some stupid argument she couldn't even remember. And Eleanor had been here, suffering, planning, hiding money and hope in a locked box because she had nowhere else to turn. The journal had more pages. More entries. More of Eleanor's story waiting to be read. Martha clutched it to her chest, the leather warm against her hands, and tried to catch her breath. Eleanor had escaped somehow. She'd gotten out, built a new life, remarried, had a son. But she'd never come back for the money. Never emptied the box or unsealed the room. She'd left it all here, locked away like evidence of a life she wanted to forget. And then, decades later, she'd left this house to Martha. Not as a burden. As an inheritance in the truest sense. A gift from one woman who'd survived to another who was barely hanging on. Martha opened the journal again, turning past the early entries to later pages. She needed to know how this story ended. She needed to understand what had happened to Eleanor in this house, and why she'd felt the need to write those words. If you're reading this, it means I failed. Because Eleanor hadn't failed. She'd survived. She'd escaped. And now, 40 years later, she'd reached back through time to save Martha too. Martha read through the night, the journal open in her lap, her phone flashlight casting shadows across Eleanor's careful handwriting. The story came together in fragments, entries written in stolen moments when Vincent was at work or asleep. Eleanor's voice on the page was younger, more frightened than Martha had ever known her sister to be. She wrote about the early days of the marriage, how Vincent had seemed charming at first, attentive, the kind of man who opened doors and remembered anniversaries. But after the wedding, something shifted. He started questioning where she went, who she talked to, why dinner wasn't ready exactly at 6. Then came the isolation. He convinced her to quit her job. They didn't need the money, he said, and wouldn't it be nice if she could focus on making their house a home? He discouraged her from visiting Martha, said families should give newlyweds space. He monitored the phone bills, questioned every call. When she suggested visiting their mother, he found reasons why it wasn't a good time. By the end of the first year, Eleanor had no job, no car of her own, no friends who called anymore. The violence started small. A grabbed wrist during an argument. A shove that he claimed was an accident. Then it escalated into things Eleanor wrote about in careful, clinical language, like describing them too directly would make them more real than she could bear. But Eleanor was planning. The journal entries shifted from documentation of abuse to something else, a strategy. She started hiding money, a few dollars at a time. $5 from the grocery change. $10 she found in Vincent's coat pocket and knew he'd never miss. $20 from her mother's birthday card that she told Vincent she'd never received. She cashed it in the lockbox her father had given her years ago, the one Vincent didn't know about, hidden in the back of a closet. She wrote about stealing away her birth certificate, her social security card, any document she might need. She wrote about memorizing bus schedules and the locations of women's shelters 2 towns over. She wrote about her fear, constant, suffocating fear, that Vincent would find out what she was planning. The entries grew more desperate as months turned into years. Vincent was getting worse. More violent, more paranoid, more controlling. Eleanor knew she was running out of time. The money in the box grew, $2,000, $5,000, eventually more than $40,000 saved over years of careful skimming and hiding. Enough to disappear. Enough to start over. And then, in an entry dated September 1981, she wrote simply, "Tonight. He's working late. I'm leaving tonight." The next page was blank. The page after that was dated 3 years later, the handwriting shakier, written in different ink. "I made it out. I left everything, the money, the box, all of it. I was too terrified to go back. He might have been waiting. He might have known. I just ran. I'm safe now. I rebuilt. But I kept the house in my name because I couldn't let him have it. It's my ghost, and I couldn't face it, but I couldn't let it go either." Martha's tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. The final entry was dated just 2 years ago, Eleanor's handwriting older now, more fragile. "If anyone ever finds this, I hope they understand. I left that money there for someone who might need it the way I needed it. I'm leaving the house to Martha. She won't understand at first. But maybe one day she'll need saving the way I did. And maybe this will be enough." Martha closed the journal, her hands shaking. Eleanor had known. Somehow, even years before Martha lost Thomas, before the medical bills and predatory loans, before the eviction notice, Eleanor had known that her sister might need a lifeline one day. She'd kept this house, this ghost, this place of pain and survival, because the money hidden inside it was more than cash. It was proof that escape was possible. That survival was worth fighting for. If you're still watching, hit subscribe and drop a like right now. And comment your country below. I want to know where all of you are following this story from. Because what comes next changes everything. Martha sat in the sealed room, surrounded by her sister's secrets, and understood finally what this inheritance really was. Not a burden. Not a dump site for a worthless property. But a gift from one survivor to another, left behind with the faith that when the time came, Martha would find it. Eleanor hadn't failed. She'd escaped. She'd survived. She'd built a new life. And then, decades later, she'd reached back through time to make sure Martha could do the same. The money wasn't just money. It was hope, locked away and waiting to be found. And now Martha held it in her hands, $43,000 and the story of her sister's courage, and knew exactly what she had to do. Martha started with the roof. She hired a contractor from 2 towns over, a man who didn't know the house's history and didn't ask questions when she paid him in cash. He looked at the sagging structure and shook his head, said it was a miracle the whole thing hadn't collapsed already. But it could be fixed. Everything could be fixed, given enough money and will. The work began in early spring. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the neighborhood, drawing curious glances from behind curtains. The ruined house that everyone had written off was coming back to life, and people noticed. They watched as new shingles went up, as the broken windows were replaced with clean glass, as the rotting porch was torn away and rebuilt with solid lumber that didn't groan under weight. Martha was there every day, watching the transformation. She fixed coffee for the workers, learned their names, listened to their stories. She felt useful again, purposeful in a way she hadn't felt since she'd stopped teaching. The house was giving her something to do with her days besides worry and count pennies and wonder how much longer she could hold on. She had the floors repaired next, including the section in the study where Eleanor had replaced the boards all those years ago. Martha stood in that room and thought about her sister kneeling in this same spot, hiding money beneath the floorboards, planning her escape. The new boards went down smooth and level, covering the old hiding place, but Martha would always know what had been there. What had been sacrificed here? The walls were patched and painted. The plumbing was restored. Electricity flowed through wires that hadn't carried current in decades. The bathroom was gutted and rebuilt. The kitchen floor was reinforced and refinished. Room by room, the house shed its decay and became something else. Something livable. Something that felt, for the first time, like it might be a home. Martha transformed with it. She gained weight back, her face losing the gaunt hollowness that had settled in during those months in the cramped studio apartment. She slept better, no longer startling awake at every sound. She planted a garden in the front yard, pulling up the waist-high weeds and turning the soil, putting in flowers that would bloom in summer. Her hands remembered the work, the simple satisfaction of making something grow. The neighbors started waving. One woman brought over a casserole. Another offered to share cuttings from her rose bushes. The house had been a ghost for so long that its resurrection felt like permission for the neighborhood to breathe again, to believe that broken things could be made whole. On the day the contractors finished, Martha stood in the living room, clean now, bright with sunlight through new windows, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but peace. The quiet certainty that she would be okay. That she had a place in the world again. She'd found a photograph of Eleanor in one of the boxes from the sealed room. Her sister at 25, standing in this very living room, sunlight catching in her hair, smiling in a way that didn't quite hide the sadness in her eyes. Martha had it framed, and now she placed it on the mantel above the fireplace the contractors had cleaned and restored. "Thank you," Martha whispered to the photograph. "For not forgetting me. For knowing I'd need this." Eleanor had left her more than money. She'd left her proof that survival was possible, that you could escape the worst moments of your life and build something new. The inheritance wasn't just the house or the cash hidden in the lockbox. It was the knowledge that Eleanor had believed in her, had trusted that Martha would be strong enough to find what had been left behind and brave enough to use it. The house that everyone had rejected, that the nephew had dumped on her like a burden he couldn't wait to be rid of, had become the thing that saved her life. Its rooms had held 40 years of secrets and pain, but they'd also held hope, carefully preserved and waiting. Martha walked to the front door and stood in the threshold, looking out at the garden she'd planted, at the neighborhood that had started to accept her, at the life she was building from the ruins of what she'd lost. She was 71 years old. She'd survived the death of her husband, the loss of her home, the slow erosion of everything she'd once counted on. And she was still here. Still standing. Still capable of growing something beautiful from broken ground. She thought about Eleanor, about the courage it must have taken to hide that money dollar by dollar, to plan an escape while living with a man who controlled everything, to finally run into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that anywhere was better than here. Eleanor had saved herself once, escaping into the darkness with empty hands and a heart full of fear. And decades later, through a house everyone else saw as worthless and a lockbox chained in a sealed room, she'd saved Martha too.